The members of the Shadow Coalition were furious to see Ben approach with a zombie army made up of their old teammates. "What did you do to Philip and the others?" one of them asked. "How did they turn into zombies?" Charles could see that many of them were ready to charge at Ben and force the information out of him. "He's no longer the Ben you know," he said. "Whatever," said a Coalition member. Undaunted, he rushed forward and grabbed Ben by the collar, but then he went limp. Ben had stabbed him with a dagger. He threw the corpse to the zombies who descended upon it in a frenzy. Although everyone there had witnessed zombies eating their companions before, it hit harder that time to know that Ben was responsible. Some of the Coalition members couldn't keep their anger in. It boiled over, and they charged at Ben. Kate also made a move to join them, but soon found herself trapped by Alice's streams of water. "Let go of me," she cried out, struggling with all her might. "Let you go?" Charles asked. "You might be ready to throw your life away on a whim, but think of the consequences. There are still people here who need you." She calmed down, watching miserably as her teammates rushed to fight the zombies. They were all at least at level 4, and after the soul energy surge, a dozen were at level 5. However, even the weakest of the zombies was at the highest stage of level 4. The Coalition members cried out as they struggled to fight the high-powered zombies. "Help! They're too strong! Save us!" The hot-blooded Coalition members, who had been so eager to charge into battle, wailed for mercy. However, their calls went unanswered. Those who had chosen not to rush in were too smart to try to save them, with some even believing that the doomed members had had it coming and deserved their fate. "Can't we all just calm down and talk this out?" Ben asked, casually throwing the corpse of another Coalition member to the zombies behind him. He pointed to Jenny, who was standing behind Elena. "Hand over that little girl, and we'll retreat immediately. Otherwise, all of you will die here." Another group of zombies shuffled into view in the distance, while a pack of mutated animals ran toward the Dawnians, surrounding their camp. The Dawnians looked helplessly around, realizing that they were completely trapped. "You've made it pretty clear whose side you're on here," said Tommy. "So why should we believe anything you say?" "You want us to hand over the child?" asked Tina. "Simple. Just hand over the crystal core inside your head, and then we can talk." The other Dawnians burst into laughter. Ben glared at them. "It's clear you haven't fully grasped the seriousness of the situation yet," he said, his face red with anger. "Maybe a quick lesson about whose side the fates are on here will help to clue you in." The group of zombies behind him swelled in number. A powerful surge of energy burst from their direction, and the Dawnians gasped. "Did they just reach level 6? One of them asked. "How? And how come there's so many of them?" At least 100 level 6 zombies were arrayed in front of them, easily outnumbering their own team. The pleasant surprise of their own breakthrough in cultivation level seemed like a distant memory in the face of such a formidable enemy who had evidently developed even faster than they had. They had hardly had time to absorb that new development before a huge mutated lynx let out a tremendous roar. They turned to see the giant pack of mutated animals it led, whose auras also grew immensely before breaking through to a higher level. "All you need to do is hand over the girl and we'll go," Ben said. "I hope you'll agree that's a better deal than the alternative." His eyes burned with determination as he stared at Jenny. It was clear that he knew exactly the extent of her power, and he was set on claiming that power for himself. "Are you really willing to follow a leader who's ready to sacrifice all your lives just for the sake of this one girl?" His voice cracked with his passion, making him sound particularly unhinged as he tried to sow distrust among the Dawnians. "Isn't it obvious? He values you less than a useless little child." Charles glared at him, but he kept silent. He surveyed his own team, and he was disappointed to see that some of them were actually taking stock of what Ben had said. He could tell that they were weighing up whether or not he really did value Jenny over them, and were trying to decide whether that affected their view of him. However, he could see that the majority of them were indifferent to Ben's ranting. "Why did you side with the zombies?" asked Kate miserably. Although she hated Ben, they had still once been teammates, along with the zombies that made up his new army. "You really want to know why?" Ben asked, cackling. "I only joined this trash coalition to get close to you. That was before Javier's obsession with his prophecies turned me into this. Look at me now. I'm a monster." He ripped open part of his shirt, revealing the rotten and scaly skin beneath. "That wasn't Javier's fault," said Kate. She wanted to explain what the rest of them had learned, that Javier had been tricked by the Death Demon tribe. "You don't understand. Javier, not his fault? Ben interrupted. Don't make me laugh. Now tell me, Javier turned me into this. Can he turn me back? I admit I made some mistakes in the past, and I don't blame you for hitting me. But did I deserve to end up like this? Can you really blame me for what I've done when you see what was done to me? Kate was deathly white and speechless. What had happened that day had turned her worldview upside down. Her head was spinning. She felt that she was stuck in some nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Are you done whining? Charles asked. If so, any chance we could hurry up and finish this? Charles had heard enough squabbling between Kate and Ben, and he hoped that Kate finally understood the dangers they were facing. He was a man of action rather than words, and couldn't be bothered to listen to any more arguing. Ben's face creased into an evil smile, and he said, It seems like the mayor has made his choice. Quentin, tell the scouts to cut off the mutant lynx's head and bring it to me, ordered Charles. It looks like it's leading the other beasts. Yes, sir, answered Quentin. 28 scouts, Dawn City's elite fighters, rushed toward the pack of angry mutated animals. Charles turned to Kate. This world is very dangerous, he said. If you're not prepared to face danger, you should find some place where you can live a quiet, peaceful life. Even then, you'll sometimes need to go out and hunt some prey for food. But as a paranormal, at least you won't starve. As Charles spoke, the black tattoo on his arm turned into the black lightning dragon. Then a massive wave of energy flowed quickly toward the dragon. Kate looked on and gasped with shock. She'd always thought she was a strong woman, able to face the post-apocalyptic era with courage, and perhaps even become one of its leaders. But faced with the reality of some of its dangers, she started to feel very differently about her future. Charles began to feel energy flowing into his body from an extract amulet. A group of level 6 warriors? Is that all you've got? He said, sneering at the enemy as his energy level began to rise rapidly. Everyone around him could also sense the energy pouring into him. It was so strong that they could almost see it, and he looked every inch the powerful ruler that he was. Never mind level 6, he shouted. You're about to see what a level 7 fighter can do. Charles wasn't particularly excited by his breakthrough. He had broken through so many levels already that level 7 was just another one to him. But Ben's expression was entirely different. He was astonished. How did you break through so fast? He demanded, his expression changing quickly from surprise to malevolence. And so what if you're at level 7? That doesn't mean you're invincible. You can still die. Charles looked at him, and then he ordered for the black lightning dragon to attack with its death breath. The dragon opened its blood-covered mouth and spat out a stream of black, foul-smelling air. Its breath swept across all the zombies, and their bodies started to rot inch by inch. Then massive bolts of black lightning flew through the air and hit the zombies' bodies, making them scream and roar in agony. Ben gave an order to the zombies. Attack! He shouted at them. The zombies ran at Charles, who wielded a crimson flame sword in his hand, and cut 3 of them down on the spot. He turned around quickly, dodging a zombie's sharp claws, and then he slashed at 2 more zombies, decapitating them as they fell to the ground. The crimson flame sword bloomed with even more energy, killing all the zombies that dared to come within range of him. When the sword's energy finally dissipated, Charles could see that the ground was littered with broken bodies. It looked like he had killed at least 20 zombies. Still running very quickly, Charles charged toward Ben. Ben opened his mouth to say something, but Charles slashed his throat before he could utter his last words. Charles had no interest in what Ben's last words might have been. Whatever you wanted to say, you can say it in your next life, he thought. He looked around to check on Jenny as he took Ben's energy into his energy storage space, slaughtering many more zombies and absorbing their power at the same time. Most zombies were creatures that knew no fear. Even if they faced an enemy stronger than themselves, they would still charge into battle. Only a very small number could feel any fear. Charles realized that, although the zombies he was fighting were high level, they didn't have much battle sense. Hurtling back and forth among the zombies, Charles felled many more with his brilliant swordsmanship. The zombies continued to fall one after another, not being able to run fast enough to avoid Charles' sword. While Charles had been a level 6 warrior, he had killed many level 7 zombies in hell. Since then, he had reached level 7 himself, and so fighting level 6 zombies was no problem. The slaughter was very one-sided. Charles was fast on his feet, and when he wielded his sword, its blade flashed so swiftly that it didn't matter how strong his opponents were. They could never keep up with him. A zombie spat a large glob of green venom at Charles, who moved so quickly that the venom landed on the zombies behind him. their skin burned away instantly. "Ice Prison Extract Amulet," called Charles. A chill spread across his fingers, and a pyramid-shaped cage made of ice appeared around the venom-spitting zombie, freezing it to the ground. Charles quickly absorbed it into his energy storage space, crushing it instantly. The Black Lightning Dragon continued spitting out bolts of black lightning, paralyzing the zombies. Charles charged through them, decapitating them as he ran. Elena and Jenny had joined the battle. Although Jenny was still very young, she'd already learned how to protect herself very well. Charles was still slaughtering zombies when a flock of blood-red crows flew toward the battlefield and launched a dive attack, swooping and plummeting toward all the fighters. Alice defended everyone by waving her hand to produce a huge fountain of water that spurted up to the crows and soaked them. Then a freezing blast of air hit them and turned the water and their feathers to ice. Some of the Knights of Hell ran forward and plunged their daggers into as many of the crows as they could. The knights knew that the crows were no threat once they couldn't fly. Charles's high-level paranormals, including Alice and Quentin, had played a vital role in the battle. Alice had frozen the wings of the blood-red crows, allowing the Knights of Hell to kill them easily, while Quentin had taken a group of scouts with him to attack the pack of mutated animals. It had been a protracted battle, but in the end, Quentin had killed the mutated lynx, the leader of the pack. Having lost their leader, a lot of the mutated animals began to flee in all directions. But as the battle continued, more and more insects and zombies rushed to the battlefield from other areas. The Daunian troops had suffered some casualties, despite being a well-coordinated fighting force. Their losses were highest in the group of newly recruited knights who weren't very experienced in combat. Their weaponry wasn't as high quality as the arms the more experienced Knights of Hell used, and they weren't able to defend themselves as well. During an unexpectedly sudden charge by the zombies, several new recruits had been killed. Charles could see what was happening, but he didn't have time to rush over and help his troops. It looks like the recent recruits still need to practice their basic training, he thought. He realized that he needed to emphasize to them that they shouldn't just rely on their special powers. He knew from personal experience as a young paranormal the importance of always using basic skills as the starting point in any fight. Had the new knights fully developed their ability to keep their seat on horseback, the zombies wouldn't have been able to pull them off their horses so easily. None of the experienced knights had suffered that indignity. The battle raged for a while longer, and the whole area became a sea of corpses. Charles put them all into his energy storage space, deciding that he would slowly refine them when he had time, or would use them as experimental subjects and materials for nurturing special plants. Keeping some of the crystal cores for himself, he distributed the rest to his troops as the spoils of war. Even though the battle was over, some of the zombies didn't retreat immediately. Some lingered just a mile or two away, where they could regain their strength. Their bodies began to change. Some grew larger, and some grew very sharp claws. Others lost their tentacles, and their eyesight improved dramatically. Fortunately for the Daunians, the threat of the mutated beasts' attack had significantly decreased after Quentin had killed their leader. Not all the mutated beasts were the same. They had mutated from different creatures, and most of the time they fought in groups of their respective species. If the leader of a particular species was killed, some of the other types of mutated beasts would fight with each other to the death. After Quentin had killed the mutated lynx, half of its pack had collapsed. Charles took an inventory of his side's losses and put some additional defenses in place. And then he summoned Bullet. Leaping up onto its back, he set off at a gallop toward the insect swarm. No one tried to stop him, and some of his troops followed him to the fight. He could sense the swarm's aura was about to reach a critical point, and hundreds of insects flew at him. Charles aimed lots of blades at the insects, hitting all of them. Watching them fall like scattered rain around him, he continued at top speed. More insects the size of his head flew at him, but the Black Lightning Dragon spewed out a stream of black breath, drowning the insects in smoke. From high up on Bullet's back, Charles swatted the swarm away, but then he saw what he had been expecting to find in the middle of the swarm. The Hive Queen, a massive worm-like creature, was surrounded by a group of monstrous insects that looked like 6-foot-tall praying mantises. The mantises all waved their huge sickle-shaped hands, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws at Charles. He wielded his Crimson Flame sword and slashed the two mantises, blocking his way in half. The rest of the swarm formed itself into a barrier to defend the Hive Queen, and some of the insects flew into the Queen's gaping mouth. As it swallowed them into its stomach, its aura became stronger and stronger. Very quickly, a burst of soul energy formed a vortex and poured into the Hive Queen's body. Again, Charles slashed at them with his Crimson Flame Sword, chopping more insects in half. There's no rush, thought Charles. I have time to collect all these bodies before I finish off the queen. Only when the Hive Queen's aura had stabilized and its fat body had grown even more did a smile appear on Charles's face. It's level 7, he shouted. Excellent. Low-level insects didn't have any crystal cores, but at least half of those above level 3 had them. And Charles knew that a swarm leader would definitely have some, because only an insect with crystal cores in its body could become a Hive Queen. Once the Hive Queen's body had finished changing and had stabilized, Charles attacked it with lightning speed. His innate sword energy easily slashed its body in two. The Hive Queen let out a loud hiss, and a gleaming flame descended on it, burning most of its body. Charles took away the rest of its corpse into the energy storage space. The higher the level of the crystal core, the greater the purity of its energy, he thought. High-level crystal cores are often used to break through the realms, but level 7 crystal cores are hard to come by. He rotated the Hive Queen's crystal core in his hand, and it refracted a beautiful clear light. Charles knew that Alice didn't need crystal cores to increase her strength, because she had a particular special power. But if Miranda, Zack, and the rest of his counselors had access to high-level crystal cores, it would be much easier for them to break through the various realms. Using his soul energy to scan the area, Charles could sense powerful auras coming from different directions. They're just stalling for time, he thought. Then a scornful expression passed across his face. Using his soul energy's perception, Charles could sense a level 7 monster like a light in the darkness. So he turned and started chasing toward it. Hurry up and get out of here, he shouted to one of the paladins. There are level 7 zombies here somewhere. There could even be a zombie king. When the 3 groups of Knights of Hell had surrounded the zombies earlier in the battle, everything had gone well at first. But the newly recruited knights had struggled to stay on their horses in the face of the zombie attack, and several had been unseated and killed. Apart from that, Charles and his troops hadn't encountered any setbacks. But now they were suddenly faced with a zombie that was easily 10 feet tall. One of the knights let out a scream, and his body emitted a golden light. The light was from a protective amulet that Charles had given to every experienced knight, but even that couldn't protect him from the sharp claws of this new zombie, and nor could the dark iron armor that had saved his life countless times before. His body was ripped apart. "Rhys!" shouted Martin, horrified to see his friend being torn to pieces in front of him. As he was about to run to help Rhys, a wall of crystallized rock sprang up in front of him. "Don't take any risks," shouted one of the Knights of Hell. "Leave this to the specialists to deal with." Then, some bio-altered paranormals rushed toward the Zombie King, desperate to kill it. Their attacking power was much greater than that of the ordinary warriors, and they could mobilize their soul energy very quickly. Ice chains began to bind the Zombie King's arms and legs. Then, the rock beneath the ground began to form a crystallized stone dragon, wrapping around the Zombie King's body. A gleaming flame spear shot toward its eyes, one of the most vulnerable parts of a zombie or a human. But one of the Zombie King's guards flung its own body into the line of fire to protect the king. So when the true fire hit the Zombie King, it left only a slight burn on its skin. The guard had taken the full force of the burn. "Retreat!" shouted a paranormal beside Martin, but it was already too late. More of Charles's paranormals started to attack the Zombie King. 2 blade-type paranormals went to work with their swords, hacking at its body, but their swords ricocheted off it with the sounds of metal on metal. The paranormals were shocked to find that a steel-like protective layer had appeared, covering the Zombie King's body. Only 2 wounds were visible from the attack by the paranormals, who had used Crimson Flame swords. Realizing they were up against something that wasn't just any ordinary zombie, the paranormals turned to run. But more of the Zombie King's guards stretched out their tentacles and wrapped them around the paranormals. Trying to chop through the tentacles, the paranormals couldn't escape, and they were quickly surrounded by more zombies. Despite looking as though they were on the brink of death, the paranormals smiled at each other, knowing that their soul energy was starting to circulate very quickly. "We'll be able to kill more zombies," one of them shouted happily. But his energy had built up too quickly for his body to cope, and he exploded. Martin's expression was grim when he saw this. "All troops, prepare to retreat," he ordered. He was a paladin, and his battle experience told him he could ill afford to lose more soldiers. Just then, the Zombie King rushed at him out of the chaos from the explosion, its sharp claws aiming at his head. Some of the knights urged their horses on and galloped toward the Zombie King, wielding their dark iron longswords. But the Zombie King fought back viciously with its claws out and sent some of the knights flying to the ground, leaving them badly injured. even their combined level 5 strength wasn't enough to overcome the Zombie King. Martin turned and ran some 20 yards. Then he shouted another order. "Stewards, you guard the rear. Captains, take your remaining ranks back to the team as fast as you can." Giving the order, he felt desperately sad, knowing that he had failed to lead his troops to victory. He had wanted to prove himself so badly, but ordering a retreat was proof that he had let himself down as well as his battalion. Watching the confident way the captains led their troops away, he felt very envious. He was senior to them, but felt he didn't have half their leadership qualities. He had fought hard for his new rank, beating several others for promotion, but he realized that leading a battle in reality was totally different than practicing during his training. Back then, when he had been a captain, he had been able to fight alongside his comrades, bearing only the responsibility that any soldier would feel for their fellow troops. But as a paladin, at the moment he had given the order to retreat, he had understood what leadership responsibility was all about. It was a heavy burden, having the power of life and death over his troops. The 18 stewards stepped forward, their soul energy circulating rapidly as they switched weapons to hold their scarlet flame blades in their hands. They fervently hoped their weapons could deal with the terrifying Zombie King. "Charge!" they shouted as they galloped at the Zombie King's guards, their nightmare horses speeding across the battlefield. They slaughtered many zombies with swords, and others were killed by the sharp horns on top of the nightmare horses' heads. Zombie corpses quickly began to pile up on the ground. The stewards continued their charge without hesitation. They were fighting for their comrades and had no intention of backing down until their task was complete. The gigantic Zombie King had been feeding on a corpse and was suddenly struck by a dozen bolts of scarlet sword energy. It let out an angry roar, frightening the stewards. They were shocked to see that their scarlet flame blades had hardly done the Zombie King any damage at all. All they could see was a dozen small surface wounds on its skin, and the largest of those was already healing over. "We'll be together in the next life," shouted one of the stewards to another. They knew their fate, and they knew it wasn't looking good. The Zombie King's guards rushed at all the stewards, who mustered as much energy as they could, preparing to fight for as long as possible before they died. The Zombie King was furious and needed to heal its wounds, so it cut off the head of one of its guards and swallowed it whole. Its wounds healed and its body recovered fully in just a few seconds. Watching the Zombie King claw at one of their fellow stewards, the others began to despair, knowing it was only a matter of minutes before it would attack them. The moment of their death was drawing near, and they fell silent as they contemplated the courage they would need to fight to the end. Then, the sky suddenly grew dark. The stewards looked up and saw the enormous black lightning dragon circling in the air above the battlefield. It swished its huge tail at the Zombie King and sent it flying, just as a dark figure surrounded by purple light swept through the Zombie King's guards. Red lights flashed as more than a dozen zombie heads fell to the ground. "Charles!" shouted one of the stewards in surprise, as the rest of his comrades began to cheer loudly. "What are you standing there for?" Charles shouted in reply, as he carried on slaughtering zombies. "Go on, get out of here. Leave this to me." The zombies might have posed a grave threat to the stewards, but they were no match for Charles. Trained to be instantly obedient to a command, the stewards turned and ran back to the main group of soldiers, relief and excitement showing in their faces. Their hero had arrived, and they knew they were safe. The Zombie King crawled along the ground, slowly hauling itself upright. More than 20 of its guards surrounded it, protecting it from attack. A gleaming long spear flickering with white light appeared in Charles's hand as he used his Divine Wrath ability. He took aim at the Zombie King, flashing his spear at great speed. Charles knew using Divine Wrath would advance the fight very quickly. The strength of his soul energy had increased hugely since he had broken through to level 7. And under his powerful control, using Divine Wrath was as easy as flicking his wrist. His spear pierced through the Zombie King's body like lightning, as the monster was unable to dodge it in time. In the next moment, white lightning and flame shot out of the Zombie King's body, and it shattered into several pieces. The zombie guards were hit by the aftershocks, some of them dropping dead to the ground as soon as they had been struck. Charles had developed Divine Wrath as a technique that allowed him to cross realms and fight very effectively. "These zombies are honored to have died under the power of Divine Wrath," he thought. His knights had been watching in a daze and wondering if Charles was actually human, so amazing were his powers and his fighting skills. Charles had easily achieved what they could not, and not only had he killed the Zombie King, but the way he had done it had also finished off more than 20 zombie guards. They wondered why some people had such skills and others didn't. Martin shook himself, and he shouted at the soldiers, "All of you, stop the retreat! Turn back and fight! With a leader like this on our side, there's no need for us to retreat." As Charles continued to sweep away more zombies, the Knights of Hell began another attack. In less than 10 minutes, the battle was over. Charles and his knights were victorious once again. Surveying the scene of death and destruction on the battlefield, Charles was silent for a moment. Then he summoned some hellfire and burned all the dead bodies. As the mayor of Dawn City, he was proud of his victory. Turning to his troops, he issued an order. "Go back to the base and get some rest. Then you'll continue the fight," he said. Charles left them to follow his command and moved on to the next battlefield. The only thing he wanted to do was kill as many enemies as he possibly could. For the next 2 hours, Charles kept fighting and killed many more zombies. He had harvested 6 level 7 crystal cores, and he felt invincible. Killing the Zombie King had been a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but Charles knew he and the Daunians still faced many enemies. They had recently slaughtered over 10,000 zombies, many insect swarms, and countless mutated beasts. Enemies flourished all around, and it was starting to feel like the battle was endless. Among the inhabitants of Dawn City, several people had already expressed doubts about Charles's decision to open up trade routes. But Charles knew the only way to keep trade and funds flowing was to fight the battles necessary before they could open the trade routes. As the fight progressed, Charles killed the level 7 leaders of the monsters one after another, so there weren't many high-level monsters left capable of mounting an attack against him. They had all gone into hiding to regroup. And what about Ben? Thought Charles. What's he up to now? When will the real mastermind behind his actions show himself? Charles took some essence water out of his energy storage space, allowing the Daunian fighters to recover their energy quickly. He then changed the defenses and used his soul energy to probe his surroundings. Sensing insect swarms, zombies, and mutated beasts, Charles thought, there aren't many people who can control all 3 enemies at the same time. Even some of the most special types of paranormals can't do that. I need more information. Calling Quentin and Joshua over to him, he started to question them about their recent experience. When you killed those mutated beasts, could you tell where they came from, or what type of mutations they had? He asked. Some of them came from farms and breeding programs, replied Quentin, like the chickens, ducks, geese, and pigs. And some of the mutated beasts came from the zoos, but there weren't any tigers or leopards. Anything else? Asked Charles. Dogs and cats, of course, replied Quentin. They're always the most difficult to deal with. Were there any wolves? Asked Charles. Quentin thought for a moment. No, none, he answered, realizing that since many of the mutated beasts had come from zoos, it was surprising that there hadn't been any wolves. Charles knew he would have to mull over this puzzle. Something didn't seem right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Why hadn't Quentin seen any wolves? What was he missing? Charles refreshed his memory about Gideon Tate and the Wolf King. From his experience in his past life, he remembered that Gideon had come from the grasslands in the north of the country. While living there, Gideon had formed an alliance with the Wolf King, the leader of the grassland wolf packs, and had deliberately allowed the wolves to run amok and cause major problems. He had become one of 9 powerful fighters, informally known as the Tungsten League, and he had been a staunch enemy of whoever had crossed him, with hatred embedded deep into his psyche. He had stopped at nothing to destroy his foes, no matter who they had been, and he had had a personal vendetta against those who he felt had wronged the residents of the grasslands, which included America as a whole. In the early days of his rise to fame, he had encountered Leonard in the northern region. Gideon and the Wolf King had led the wolf packs and slaughtered Leonard's entire army. Leonard's giant white lion mount had been badly injured, and Leonard had suffered very heavy losses. Once Gideon had discovered Leonard's ambitions for America, he had avoided the northern region and left Leonard to destroy the country. As Charles pondered the past, he remembered that once Leonard's forces had been destroyed, the northern region had fallen under the control of the military. They had started to exploit the area for minerals for the armed forces and had sent extra troops to the area because it had been thought to be a very tough place. Having defeated Leonard, Gideon had needed another target, so he turned his attention to the Midwest. The beast had originated in the Northwest, thought Charles, so I'd have expected Gideon to have taken advantage of that. But for some reason he chose to seek refuge in the Demon Realm. Charles knew that the Demon Realm was a very strange place, but there was much about it that he didn't yet know. Regardless, both beasts and demons were his enemy, and the main thing he felt he needed to know about them was how to kill them. The sky began to grow dark, Under the influence of the recent energy surge, some of the counselors had broken through to level 6. Some of the stronger paranormals had also reached the same level. Tina walked over to where Charles was sitting and gave her report. The army in the Midwest has already gathered reinforcements. There are now 2 divisions, and they're moving quickly in this direction. I expect them to get here in about 2 hours' time. It's dark now, said Charles. Are they really going to march at night? In their communications with us, they said that these supplies are very important, and they want them distributed to the people who need them as soon as possible, replied Tina. So they dispatched their 2 fastest armored divisions to escort the supply convoy, and they were also worried that we might be in danger. Idiots, exclaimed Charles. There's no reason to march at night. But he had overlooked the importance of the specialist equipment to the eastern states. Think about it. There's still a whole load of zombies there, said Tina. And although the troops in that area have good supplies of ordinary guns and ammunition, they urgently need more high-quality equipment. We really need to get these armaments where they're needed as soon as we can. Gideon hasn't been found yet, thought Charles. Attacking a weapons convoy would be exactly what he'd want to do. And he's perfectly capable of putting a fighting force together and working out all the logistics to mount an assault. He began quickly issuing orders. Quentin, Joshua, wake up all the people in the scout camp and get them here now. Tina, you and Hugh will lead the Knights of Hell to take charge of defending the convoy. Alice, Elena, Jenny, stir yourselves and get ready to fight. Within a few moments, all the people he had summoned had gathered around him. Some were bleary-eyed from sleep, and Alice had splashed her face with ice-cold water to wake herself up. Even though Elena and Jenny didn't know what was going on, they knew the importance of obeying Charles's orders quickly. Listen up, everyone, said Charles. This is important. Put on your black uniforms and make sure you each take a dark iron sword with you. And don't, I repeat, don't, use a crimson flame sword, even if you're in danger. Understand? Everyone nodded and watched Charles change Bullet into an ordinary level 6 nightmare horse. They were moving under cover of darkness, so they had to dress in black kit and keep anything bright or reflective well hidden. It was imperative that they didn't give their location away. Once everyone had followed Charles's orders, the group disappeared into the dark of night. The sound of gunfire rang out in the dark night. A few tired and ragged soldiers shot blindly at the attacking zombies, cursing that the darkness led most of their bullets astray. They weren't experienced soldiers, but rather civilians who had been recruited after the beginning of the apocalypse. Although they were still getting used to many aspects of their new positions, they were falling into step with the rest of the army. Still, there hadn't been the time to give them proper training, and they often didn't understand their superiors' orders. Just our luck that they attacked at nighttime, one of them said. Keep quiet or else you'll attract more of them, said another. Oh, shut up, said the first. Don't you think our gunshots will bring them all here anyway? Just save your strength for fighting rather than arguing, said his comrade. Although the soldiers complained, they understood that they had no choice but to follow the orders of the higher-ups and struggle forward. The zombies, bugs, and mutated beasts all seemed even more violent at night. In the first 10 minutes of trying to march while under attack, more than 20 people were killed. It seemed that the more they strived to fight back, the more enemies they attracted with their deafening gunfire. However, the commanders had stressed the value of their cargo and that they needed to protect it at all costs. Fortunately, they had already started making preparations for such an attack when they had first set off from Dawn City. They had been aware that opening the trade route wouldn't be as simple as sending each convoy on its way without protection, and that they would need to defend against enemies along the way. They expected that things would improve as time went on, and that future convoys wouldn't need to be so well defended. After all, if their sole aim had been the safe transportation of particular batches of goods, Charles could have simply stored them in the energy storage space at one end and taken them out at the other. The reason they had opened the route in the first place was so that everyone could use it. Over the past few days, the 2 divisions of soldiers, who had originally been used primarily as support troops, had cleared out the zombies from the 3 nearby counties. That had allowed for the smooth transport of the resources, and it was also why the route was safe enough that they could even consider traveling at night. Their recent casualties were unfortunate, but were much lower than they had been in previous battles. In the center of the division, some commanders sat on the roof of a large truck, from where they had the best possible visibility of the attack. Some paranormals were arranged nearby to keep an eye out for bugs attacking from the distance. Everything's gone well up till now, one of the commanders said. It seems like the cleanup work a few days ago went smoothly. I just don't know where these new monsters came from. Since they started attacking, we haven't lost too many troops, and the ones who died, It was only because they couldn't see the insects in the darkness. "The casualties are a necessary sacrifice," said another commander. "If we can get these weapons to our destination, we'll be able to significantly turn the tide of the war. We'll save thousands of innocents, so it doesn't matter if a few of our soldiers die along the way. After today's soul energy surge, I heard that the zombies in various places nearby have become stronger. If we can't get these weapons where they need to be, the consequences might be catastrophic." Not only had the soul energy surge left the zombies and insects physically stronger, but it had also increased their determination to get at the resources that the Daunian team was transporting. The army understood that the equipment would increase the strength of whoever used it by at least one level, and that level could make all the difference. Although the various survival bases had been doing their best to slowly improve using crystal cores and minerals, it was hardly like the zombies would wait around until their victims were sufficiently prepared to fight back. And so the weapons would give the defenders the immediate boost in power that they so badly needed. That was the main reason they needed to push on as quickly as they could, even if it meant traveling at night. An officer reached the commanders. "I've got bad news," he said. "We've lost contact with one of the platoons behind us." One of the commanders frowned. "There's been no news at all?" he asked. "We've heard nothing," said the messenger. "Not even sounds of fighting." The commanders looked at each other with serious expressions. If the zombies or bugs had successfully launched a sneak attack on the rear platoon, there was every chance that they might manage the same thing on the main force. The soldiers weren't used to the zombies and bugs using such considered strategies. It seemed to prove that the energy surge really had advanced them to the next levels, granting them higher intelligence. It made them wonder what their longer-term strategies might be. "Pass on the order that we're entering a state of martial law," said one of the commanders. "We've done all we can trying to fight in the darkness. We need to hurry on and try to fight back in daylight. By attacking at night, the enemy has made it clear that they don't feel confident fighting us head-on in daylight. We need to exploit that." "But sir," said the officer, trailing off. "If we can't hurry on, even more of us will die," said the commander. "So speed up. If the enemy wants to stop us, they'll have to catch us first." The officer realized that his hands were in tight fists, the nails digging into his palms. He released them, and then he went to order the troops to speed up. Although the order sounded a little heartless, he knew they had little choice. The soldiers forged on, but they hadn't gone far when they began to make out pairs of green eyes in the dark. Some of the less experienced soldiers were frightened and started muttering among themselves. "What is that? Green eyes? Looks like wolves' eyes. Why are there wolves out here? We're surrounded by zombies and monster insects, and it's the wolves you're taking objection to?" "Quit chatting," shouted one of the commanders. "Get ready to fight." The wolves pounced on the soldiers. The night was soon full of the sounds of gunfire and screams. The paranormals rushed over to help. However, they had only fought off a few of the wolves before the pack retreated completely. "What's going on?" a soldier asked. "Did they really retreat?" "I think we scared them," said a paranormal smugly. But then a scream came from the opposite direction, followed by more gunshots. "Another attack!" shouted a paranormal, and he hurried with his team to the new location. When they arrived, they found dead soldiers lying on the ground, but no wolves. The leader of the paranormals took a deep breath. "Did the wolves just vanish into thin air?" he asked. "How do they know to attack from every direction?" "They're trying to scare us," said a soldier. "They want us to scatter." Another scream tore through the night air, from the south that time. The soldier looked at the paranormal, and he said, "This is bad." Gideon was surrounded by some figures in black robes. Nearby, a pack of wolves was feasting on its latest kill. "Why haven't you launched an all-out attack yet?" asked one of the robed men. "You could eliminate these puny soldiers in no time." "Do I need you to teach me how to do things?" Gideon said, looking at the man coldly. The robed man averted his gaze. "Of course not," he said. "I didn't mean to suggest that. It's just that we might not get a better opportunity to attack anytime soon," said another of the robed figures. "But we wouldn't dare to tell you what to do, of course." They had learned that if they didn't treat their leader with the utmost deference, he would throw them to the wolves without a moment's hesitation. Gideon stroked the fur of a large wolf beside him. "Your troops are so useless, they wouldn't last a day if they launched an attack," he said, his voice full of disdain. "You're more than welcome to prove me wrong. If you manage to take down one of their camps, then I might start to listen to your advice." The only reason that he was cooperating with the robed figures was that they had the ability to control zombies and mutated beasts. Anyway,
He would have considered joining forces with anyone who would help him in his plans. However, it had been a full day, and they still hadn't managed to make much progress. And then they had had the nerve to suggest that they launch a full-scale assault. He couldn't wrap his head around their thinking. They clearly hadn't considered the risk to his wolves. A pack of wolves returned from its recent hunt with some dead bodies. Gideon laughed. "That's more like it," he said. "One by one, we'll kill all those weaklings off. They'll all cower in terror at my fearsome wolves." Some more wolves arrived, with the bodies of 2 of their slain kin in their mouths. When the large wolf next to Gideon saw them, it let out a sorrowful howl. "They dared to kill our comrades?" asked Gideon. "Then they'll surely pay. We'll track down whoever did this." He leaped to his feet and climbed onto a giant wolf with gray fur. "We'll leave none alive," he shouted. The wolves charged forward, leaving the black-robed figures behind. "He's angry," said one of them. "Yeah," said another. "I doubt those soldiers will be making it back to their camp in one piece." They were so caught up in their chatter that they didn't notice the figures that had appeared behind them. All of a sudden, they felt their skin prickle on the backs of their necks, but by that point, it was too late. They turned to see swords pointed at them, and their screams were cut short as the new arrivals lunged forward. After killing the black-robed men, Charles put their bodies into the energy storage space to use as fertilizer. At least they'll be useful in there, he thought. Quentin was at his side. "Are we going to hunt the others down?" he asked him. "No need," said Charles, shaking his head. "They aren't far away." Green eyes appeared in the darkness, and then Gideon rode his giant wolf back into the camp. "You really tricked us into leaving the camp just so you could kill those cowards?" he asked. Quentin felt a chill run down his spine, shocked that Gideon had so easily seen through their ruse and had arrived so quickly with his wolves. In fact, if Gideon hadn't announced himself, the wolves might well have been able to take Charles and his scouts entirely unawares. Alice and Elena were also there, ready to fight. They too were shocked that they had been ensnared in their own ambush. "How'd you see through our plans?" Joshua asked. "We did our best to conceal ourselves." "Your auras are too strong to hide," Gideon said. Wolves surrounded him, explaining why he clearly had no need to mince words or conceal his thinking. A large gray wolf pounced on one of the scouts. The scout was able to defend himself in time, slashing at the wolf with his sword and sending it flying to the ground. The scouts were all at high levels. They could easily defend against such basic attacks. "Your sneak attacks are useless," said Charles. He drew his crimson flame sword and turned to his team. "Attack," he cried, a red light bursting from him. In the past, the Knights of Hell had needed Charles to make motivational speeches to raise their morale before a battle, but they had since become so experienced that they only required a simple order. And so at his single command, they began to charge, throwing themselves into their fight. Half of Charles's scouts were knights, and the others were high-level paranormals. Before they had left, Charles had given them crystal cores to improve their strength. Even without the crystal cores, 6 of his paranormals had reached level 6 in the Soul Energy Surge. With a wave of her hand, Alice summoned a large amount of water that she directed at the wolves. When it reached them, it immediately turned into ice. However, the wolves were strong enough that they were able to shake the ice off, shattering it. Still, their attack was delayed. Quentin and the others pulled out their Crimson Flame swords. The swords' Crimson Flame Energy gems had been supplemented with some Blue Flame Energy gems, so their blades glowed purple in the darkness. Just as they were about to meet the enemy, the scouts turned their backs on Charles on cue. A glaring white light appeared in his hand as he hurled dozens of blazing sun amulets at the wolves. In addition to the blaze of their fire, their light blinded the wolves, scattering and staggering them. The scouts had known to turn away in time so as not to be blinded. They took advantage of the wolves' disorientation by running in and slashing them, tearing them apart and dyeing the ground red with their blood. Gideon watched the slaughter, fuming. "Die!" roared Gideon, pulling a curved sword from his waistband. The blade shone as bright and piercing as the moon as he brought it down toward Charles. Even though the light from the blazing sun amulet still filled the air, he didn't seem at all dazed. He had developed his senses of smell and hearing beyond even those of paranormals. He reached Charles and swung his sword at him, while the Wolf King attacked from the other side. Just before they got to him, though, black lightning crashed down from the sky, striking the wolf's side.
The Black Lightning Dragon swept down and clashed with the wolf. Charles swept his Crimson Flame sword at Gideon's weapon, cutting its blade in half. "Damn you!" cried Gideon as the shards clattered on the ground. Charles's eyes were wild with excitement as he lunged his blade at Gideon. It seemed to meet its mark, piercing flesh and spraying hot blood all around. However, it soon became clear that it wasn't Gideon that Charles had killed, but the wolf that he had rode upon. At the last moment, the wolf had thrown itself in the way of Charles's sword, sacrificing itself to save its master. Charles pulled the sword out of the wolf, but not before Gideon was able to leap from his dying mount to another wolf and charge away. As he rode out, he let out a loud whistle, calling the entire pack to follow him. Meanwhile, the Wolf King and the Black Lightning Dragon were tangled together in a bloody fight. The wolf had been caught off guard, giving the dragon a chance to tear a chunk of flesh from its back. The wolf howled in pain and fled into the distance with the rest of the pack. However, just as they were about to escape, dozens of hellhounds ran out of the darkness, led by a two-headed hellhound. Charles smiled to see them arrive, glad that his plan was going as he wished. Gideon blew a horn, ordering more than 20 of his wolves to charge at the hellhounds. It was clear that they wouldn't stand a chance, but they would give the remaining wolves a chance to escape. "We have to let them go," said Joshua, heavy-hearted. "We can't," said Charles. His eyes fell on a piece of meat on the ground. It was the chunk of flesh that the Black Lightning Dragon had torn from the Wolf King. It was full of death energy, and Charles knew he would be able to use it to track them down. Even without it, though, the hellhounds' sense of smell was extremely sensitive, and they would be able to trail the enemy within 100 miles. After dealing with the wolves that had been left behind to cover the rear, Charles put their bodies into the energy storage space. He ordered the treants to turn their hides into clothing. More than 60 wolves had died in the fight, leaving around 2/3 of the original number to escape. "Do we really need to chase them?" Elena asked. She wasn't afraid of death, but was worried about making a brand new enemy of Gideon, who might then turn his eye on targeting Jenny. "We do," said Charles, glaring. "That man has to die." Nobody objected, no matter their thoughts on the subject. The scouts prepared to set off again. "Who are these people?" Gideon wondered as he rode off, clutching the wound that Charles had inflicted after cutting his sword in two. He had never expected that he would come across such a powerful opponent after all the time that he had spent preparing to launch his plan. He didn't feel at fault, though. He knew it was just that he wasn't fighting with strong enough weapons. He looked at the Wolf King's wounds and cursed. "How dare he bring harm to my wolves?" he thought. The Wolf King was his most loyal companion. In fact, he was more angered by the wolves' injuries than his own. They soon ran into a group of mutated beasts. He ordered the wolves to kill them and offer their bodies to the Wolf King so that it could heal and restore its energy. They managed to kill more than 100 of the creatures in a short space of time. Just as the wolves were about to feast, though, the Wolf King's nose twitched and it let out an angry roar. "They're here," said Gideon. "Run!" More than 30 knights galloped at them from out of the darkness, their crimson flame swords glowing bright red as they charged at the wolves. Gideon didn't dare to fight them, and he instead tried to escape on his wolf mount. As he charged away, he heard the desperate howls of his wolves behind him, but he couldn't bear to turn his head. He had come to realize that he was no match for the man who had led the scouts into his camp. If he turned around to make a stand, they would surely cut him down. The knights killed over 10 of the wolves before falling back. Only then did Gideon heave a sigh of relief. But he had hardly gotten his breath back before a group of zombies shuffled out at them. "Zombies now, too?" he thought, incredulous. He particularly detested zombies, not for the threat they presented, but because they were inedible, and so couldn't benefit his wolves at all. Once again, he gave the order to escape. They soon ran into another pack of mutated beasts. He commanded the wolves to hunt them down and feast on them, but then the knights arrived once more. "What more do you want?" he shouted at them. He couldn't understand how the knights had managed to track them down so easily. He knew that if the scouts found it easy to keep on his trail, his wolves wouldn't have a chance to pause in between fights, so they would need to feast while they fought in order to keep their strength up. However, making such a plan was one thing, and convincing the wolves was another. The wolves didn't dare to linger for the time it took to eat, and instead were desperate to run for their lives. After the wolves had fled again, Charles put away the mutated beast corpses they had left behind in the energy storage space. "They're good at hunting," he thought. "Almost as good as I am." He distributed some roasted meat from the energy storage space and handed it out to his followers. "How'd you manage to roast it so quickly?" Quentin asked with a quizzical look.
It wasn't the first time he had wondered about the abilities of the storage space. He knew that Charles was able to deposit ore in it and later take out weapons, but he had assumed that in the meantime Charles had refined the weapons himself. But that time, Charles seemed to remove the roast meat almost as soon as he had deposited it raw. "It's a special place with many uses," said Charles mysteriously. "There's no need to let everyone know its secrets, so keep quiet about it." Charles didn't want to go into any more detail on the workings of the energy storage space, and the scouts had accepted that they didn't need to learn more than what he had already told them. In fact, they were delighted that he had already told them as much as he had. They thought it showed his trust in them. A leader with no belief in his followers would never have revealed so much about one of his trump cards. Charles knew that the time and effort he had spent growing the energy storage space and its crucial role in his strategies meant that it would be too difficult to keep it a secret, and so he had decided to reveal a few choice details about it to the scouts. Besides, he had already reached level 7 and knew that he had plenty of other tricks up his sleeve. He felt confident that he had given his followers enough information for the time being. "Hurry up and eat," he told them. "Our hunt isn't over yet." The scouts rushed to eat the meat he had given them. When they had finished, he passed them some essence water to quickly recover the rest of their strength. Then he allowed them a short rest before ordering them to mount up and resume the chase. "They're not playing around," thought Gideon. He was filled with fury and had no way to vent it. The knights were just too strong, and his wolves were no match for the hellhounds. The Wolf King was also exhausted and humiliated. "We need to run!" cried Gideon. He knew that turning around to counterattack wasn't an option, so he carried on with his flight. After fleeing for an hour and a half, he arrived at a small settlement where they were met by a group of rough-looking men and women, who quickly surrounded them. They broke out into a mass of questions. "How did it go? How many of them did you kill? How come you brought back so few wolves? They didn't defeat you, did they?" In all, fewer than 60 wolves had returned. When they took stock of how many wolves had been killed, they fell into shocked silence. They knew the Wolf King's strength very well, and were shocked to see that he'd been so severely wounded. Gideon grabbed a scimitar from one of the men and slid it into his own scabbard. "These people dare to harm our wolf brethren," he called out. "They're despicable. Now, tell me, what are we going to do about it?" "Kill them!" cried the crowd. "Make them pay in blood!" They had lived side by side with the wolves for many years, and couldn't bear the idea of a young upstart threatening them. At that moment, the Wolf King turned its head and howled. "They're here," Gideon snarled. "Time to show these invaders what we're made of. Let them see that they're nothing but sheep, and we're the wolves." "Kill them!" shouted one of the warriors, as they all waved their scimitars and followed the pack of wolves in the direction of the approaching knights. Gideon was glad to see that the people were so easily provoked into battle. He leapt onto the back of his giant wolf, and he called to the Wolf King, "Let's go." He led all the surviving wolves in the other direction from his warriors. He wasn't about to stay and die with the rest of them. Instead, he would let the fools distract the knights long enough that he could get away and find somewhere he could regroup before making a comeback. He told himself that when he returned, he would avenge the people who were giving their lives for him. The wolf pack disappeared into the night once again, leaving behind miserable screams. "Do you still want to continue the hunt?" Alice asked Charles when the fight was over. She looked around at all the people they had just killed, feeling miserable. It seemed that no matter how many massacres she followed Charles into, she never seemed to get used to them. "I need to find that man and kill him," said Charles calmly. He knew that by killing Gideon and the Wolf King, he would be able to save the country from further disaster down the line. In his previous life, the Wolf King had taken command of all the wolves in the northern grasslands and led them to destroy most of what was left of civilization. In addition, he also wanted the simple satisfaction of killing his enemy. He clearly remembered that the Wolf King had breached his survival base and killed many innocents. He couldn't let that kind of thing happen again. After clearing out Gideon's camp, he continued to lead his team forward. As the Hellhounds had grown tired and weak from the fight, he invoked the contract between species to summon new ones who would be able to keep up with the rest of the group. After 10 hours of pursuit, they seemed no closer to reaching their enemy, and so they forged on, traveling many more miles. Meanwhile, Gideon and his wolves sped across the landscape. Several of the wolves collapsed with exhaustion and couldn't carry on, until only 20 remained in the pack. They came across the survivors' camp, where they rushed in to take hostages, hoping that they might use them to waylay Charles or even change his mind. However, Charles and his scouts opened fire as soon as they came upon the camp, igniting the place with gunfire and explosive flame amulets. The camp was soon ablaze, its inhabitants coughing and screaming as they tried to flee. You can't escape anymore, Charles called out to Gideon as they approached a muddy river. This is the end of the road. Why do you want to kill me so badly? Gideon shouted. You chased me all the way here, but why do you hate me so much? You think I need a reason to kill you? Asked Charles with a sneer. Although Charles's followers were exhausted, it was clear that Gideon's wolves were even more worn out. And so at Charles's order, the scouts readied their final attack.
You're really going to try to kill the Wolf King? Gideon asked aghast. He stroked the wolf's fur protectively. He couldn't believe that he had tried so hard to escape, and yet Charles had hunted him down all the same. He had fought through zombie hordes and insect swarms, and had even taken hostages, but it had all been in vain. The Wolf King let out a loud howl, and the other giant wolves narrowed their eyes. They hunkered low to the ground, their front claws clutching the earth. They were ready to pounce. The scouts charged, seeming once again to form one single entity as they galloped at the enemy on their nightmare horses. Just as they were about to collide with a pack of wolves, water from the nearby river surged up and over at them, obstructing their advance. It moved at such speed that those leading the charge had no time to dodge and were blasted away. Those behind them were able to guide their nightmare horses to propel themselves from the wall of water and land nearby. They had hardly had a chance to recover when thousands of water arrows shot at them. Alice created an ice wall, blocking the arrows. Within moments, the wall collapsed with a loud bang, but she had bought enough time for the scouts to gather themselves and use their weapons to block the next volley of arrows. The water parted, and crowds of mutated sea creatures stepped through, accompanied by wolves. The creatures were made up of turtles, fish, and shrimp, all of which were so severely mutated that they stood on their hind legs. They stepped through the water wall and rushed at the scouts. What's happening? Wondered Gideon. He didn't understand why the sea creatures had come to his rescue. However, he was so grateful that he soon forgot his confusion. He whistled, and the wolves prepared to flee across the river. They were fast enough that it seemed unlikely that they would have any problems making the crossing. Meanwhile, the scouts were busy fighting the sea creatures. The creatures weren't individually very strong, each one either at level 3 or 4, but there were many of them, and it would take a while to defeat them all. A large number of water element creatures called water guards appeared in the river. Like the mutated sea creatures, the water guards weren't very powerful. Each had been cast by a paranormal only at level 2. However, they couldn't be killed unless the entire water structure was destroyed. Of all paranormals, water-powered types were the most versatile, and were the best at delaying the enemy. Although Charles was extremely angry, he managed to remain calm. As far as he was concerned, the aquatic creatures simply provided further evidence that the different tablets had their downsides and risks. Not only the Genesis and Poseidon tablets, but his Celestial tablet too. He would still be able to use it, but would need to take great care. For now I need to focus on killing the Wolf King, he thought. He summoned the Black Lightning Dragon again. He jumped on its back and continued his hunt from the sky. Gideon rode on the back of the giant wolf. They went crashing through the river, the wolf's huge feet sending great waves rushing out in all directions. It made the other side in no time, sending so much water flying into the air that it even struck the Black Lightning Dragon, causing the creature to tremble and falter. However, the dragon had become so strong that it quickly recovered from the blow. On the dragon's back, Charles cast his Divine Wrath, summoning a long spear that flickered with white lightning. He hurled it at the Wolf King at great speed, and it exploded on impact. The wolf let out an agonized roar before its entire body blew apart. Lightning and flames burst out from it, killing lots of the creatures in the water. The giant wolf that Gideon rode was also caught in the blast, throwing it off balance and into the water, taking Gideon with it. Is it really that easy to kill one of the 10 beasts of the apocalypse? Wondered Charles. It felt unreal. In his previous life, he had known the Wolf King's strength to be on par with the Black Lightning Dragons, and yet he had managed to kill it with one attack. On reflection, though, he thought it wasn't too surprising. In his new life, he had encountered the Wolf King sooner after the apocalypse than he had in his last, and the beast hadn't had time to grow to its full power yet. What terrified Charles most about the Wolf King was its ability to lead the wolves. In his past life, tens of thousands of wolves had run amok, with the bones of their dead littering the landscape. The wolves in his new life hadn't grown to that scale, and it seemed that with the death of the Wolf King, they might not be able to. He didn't have time to think any longer about it, though. He looked downriver, trying to catch a glimpse of Gideon. At Charles's order, a command made it indisputable by the contract between species, the Black Lightning Dragon lunged down into the river. The surface of the water churned, with huge waves rising up and crashing down. The mutated aquatic creatures underwater tried their best to stop Charles and the dragon, but they were no match for them. The dragon blasted the creatures with its lightning, while Charles cut his crimson flame sword in every direction, killing scores of the beasts. However, there were a great many creatures in the river, and before long, the water was so murky and unclear that it was impossible for Charles to see clearly. He was unable to use his soul energy to help him detect his enemies, as it didn't allow him to detect very well underwater. Nevertheless, the water was soon red with blood, with the bodies of many beasts bobbing to the surface. 10 minutes later, Charles climbed up from the riverbank. Then the Black Lightning Dragon flew to his side and returned to its place as a tattoo on his arm. By that point, the scouts had been able to kill all the mutated aquatic creatures, leaving their hideous corpses strewn across the ground. "Are you okay?" asked Alice, running over. When she saw the look in his eyes, though, she was so scared that she recoiled. "Gideon got away," he said. "The aquatic army messed with my plans again." Although Charles's expression remained composed, the scouts could see the coldness in his eyes and kept quiet. His icy calm was even more intimidating than any outward display of anger. He had tried to locate Gideon's body in the water, but had found no trace. Although he couldn't be sure exactly how Gideon had gotten away, he knew it had something to do with the aquatic creatures. He hadn't sensed the giant turtle's aura, but the creatures had fought with a courage and determination that convinced him that some other party had been hid behind their attack. He knew that the giant turtle was connected to the Water Mansion, just as the Water Mansion was linked to the Poseidon Tablet. They must have seen me as a threat, he thought. That's why they tried to stop me, to allow the future to unfold the way it did in my past life. I need to be careful. Anything I do that goes against their plan might well incur their wrath again. The idea chilled him to the bone. He wondered how things might have played out if he hadn't accessed the celestial treasure in his previous life. He was beginning to feel more and more that the three great treasures were merely tools used by the people behind the scenes to manipulate humanity. After the fighting at the river was over, Charles contacted Tina, who told him that the transaction had gone smoothly. The 4 Daunian counselors were in the process of communicating with the military, which had bought the weapons and consumables for a large amount of crystal cores and mutated beast furs. Under Dawn City's influence, clothes made from mutated beast fur had gradually replaced the clothes of the old era. After all, they were tougher than conventional materials, and they were able to completely protect against the attacks of some lower-level bugs. Due to the Midwest's large population, there was no shortage of zombies there. Its vast swaths of farmland also meant that there were many swarms of mutated insects in the area. The threat posed by so many enemies was great enough that there would always be a market for the right equipment. Someone armed with a dark iron sword could fight against an enemy at level 5 or even level 6, and so such weapons were in high demand. Charles had also been able to sell many throwing knives to the army. He'd given them a 60% discount, so he was confident that they would be pleased with the deal. "Carry on organizing the trade," he told Tina over his communication token. "After you've sold everything, take the knights to tackle the problem with the mutated beasts. Although there are a lot of beasts, they shouldn't pose too much of a threat to you. Still, be careful." "Aren't you coming back?" asked Tina in a shocked voice. "I still have some things to do," he said. "Take care of my business." He turned off the token, knowing that Tina and the counselors wouldn't need any more details to know what to do. And if they did need further instruction, then they were so out of step with his aims that he had no use for them. The great benefits that he could provide attracted all sorts of people to his side, and he knew that he could count on them to fulfill his plans. He wasn't worried about the situation in the Midwest. In his previous life, the sudden arrival of a great many mutated beasts had brought a huge disaster to the area, with more than 2 million dying. He knew that one reason so many people had been killed was that they had been caught unawares without any good weapons to defend themselves. Also, after the beasts had destroyed the farmland, there had been a food shortage, which had led to even more deaths. After the successful trade they had just made, though, Charles knew that the people in the Midwest were well prepared for any attack. They had ended up with tens of thousands of weapons, as well as plentiful food supplies and clean water. They were also assisted by some knights who would help to fight the beasts. Charles had made sure they were well prepared, knowing that they couldn't afford to face the same disaster as in his previous life. In that life, he had come across many arrogant would-be leaders asserting themselves as the saviors of humanity, but none had ever lived up to the claim. Rather than trying to win the spotlight in his new life like the others had in his past one, Charles simply did what was needed of him to keep his followers alive. After ending the call, he took some special lilies from the energy storage space. They were Hellfire lilies, which could increase one's strength and improve one's aptitude. They had been grown from some of the seeds that he had collected the last time he had gone to Hell. He had planted them in the energy storage space on his return. The lilies were fairly common in Hell, and he had managed to bring back more than a dozen of them. Hell was on a higher plane than Earth, so what was considered a great treasure in the human realm was commonplace in the underworld. After leaving behind some lily seeds to continue planting, Charles drew some essence water from the spring. He used the ice amulet to freeze the water before breaking the ice. He then placed the lily seeds into it. It quickly boiled up, requiring Charles to add more ice. People had long used old traditions to draw certain medicinal properties from plants, but fortunately Charles didn't need to know those for what he intended to do. Instead, he only needed simple chemistry. He knew that one of the key properties of the lilies was their fiery nature, which would improve the human body's aptitude. However, that fire was very strong and could easily cause damage to the human body if consumed unadulterated, and that was why he neutralized it with the ice. Even if there was still a little more fire than ice, it wouldn't matter. Charles was confident that even a level 4 paranormal would be able to resist the worst of those effects. Meanwhile, he knew that those he would be giving the lilies to were at the highest stage of level 5. A level 5 paranormal could even survive swallowing the lily seeds raw, and so he didn't have to worry about them consuming the neutralized plants. "Come here," he called to the scouts. "Drink some of this water." He placed the refined lily seeds into the glass bucket and poured the water into some cups, which he offered to the scouts. "Everyone drink a cup of this, then rest for an hour, and keep drinking and resting until the effects have passed." After drinking Charles's potion, Quentin and Joshua broke through to level 6, and everyone else who drank it broke through to the next level too. It happened so suddenly that they weren't sure if it had really happened. However, they couldn't deny that their soul energy had grown more sensitive, and that their perception of the energy had become more precise. "Now sit down and use the energy concentration technique," said Charles. They followed his instructions. After drinking the medicine, they felt as if a fire was burning in their hearts. That was because the energy needed to fully circulate their bodies and hearts to be calmed and refined. Despite their doubts, their new power was no illusion. Its potency was simply the unique effect of the Hellfire lilies, which had the power to stoke the energy in a person's heart. As the center of the body's blood circulation, the heart was the most important point for the circulation of soul energy. Therefore, by stimulating the heart, the lilies ignited a person's soul energy production. When their energy was purified and refined by the process, it then naturally had a beneficial effect on the rest of the body, such as building the strength of its bones and muscles. The scouts also benefited from the use of extract amulets, which honed the channels of a person's soul energy and increased their affinity with the soul energy of the outside world. The amulets also helped to control and direct the flow of soul energy. In addition, they protected the user from absorbing too much soul energy. However, as they had reached such high levels, they were able to control more soul energy than in the past. "I have a question," said a light-powered paranormal, raising his hand. "Me too," said another paranormal. "I feel like the soul energy in my body has changed somehow," said a third. "Davin, you go first," said Charles, pointing at the light-powered paranormal. "I'm light-powered," said Davin, "but after the transformation, I can feel an extra current of energy in my body that feels more like that of a bio-altered paranormal, and I can feel my strength increasing. Am I developing the skills of more types, bio-altered and warrior types?" Charles used his detection abilities and shook his head. "Why do you think I'm any authority on the matter?" he asked. The cultivation system was still little understood at that point, which was why Davin had asked the question. "All I know is that you're much more powerful than any of us," he said. Nobody disagreed. It was well known that in addition to his martial arts abilities, Charles had a great many elemental powers. While most paranormals had only managed to master one of the ability types, Charles had managed at least 3. "It isn't a case of learning several types," Charles said. "Rather, all types had the same origin." The paranormals were shocked to hear that the different types were just different uses of the same single source of soul energy. Charles explained that when they used their abilities,
They were merely focusing the soul energy through a particular element. However, the original soul energy itself originated from that one source. Bio-altered types are able to control the soul energy in their bodies to manage their skills, rather than the elemental power in the outside world, he said. However, they're also able to use elemental energy to create weapons, and even control the properties of metal, wood, and lightning. Some have also harnessed water and fire, which they can use in close combat even if they don't have strong long-range attacks. Most people thought it was unfortunate that martial artists weren't unable to awaken any paranormal powers. Although they could refine and harness the soul energy in their bodies, they were unable to channel it into the same abilities that the paranormals could make use of. Instead, they needed to rely on methods like the energy concentration technique to improve their physical strength. Quentin was deep in thought. In other words, although the elemental and bio-altered paranormals can use martial arts skills, martial artists can't use paranormal abilities? He asked. But martial artists are still able to use methods to make them very strong. Is that right? Charles nodded. Yes, he said. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how someone wins in a fight. Whether it's through paranormal powers or through honing their physical strength, a winner is a winner. Davin was puzzled. Then why are we bothering with our powers? He asked. 2 reasons, said Charles. First is that you have too much soul energy in your body, and you need a way to expel it. Working on your powers ensures that it doesn't build to the extent that it causes you damage. Secondly, there is great benefit to mastering the manipulation of the elements. If you can build your use of each element, you might even one day reach my level. I doubt we'll ever manage that, said Davin with a slight smile. Even so, he wished that he might one day wield a power on Charles's level. Could I really become as strong as him? He wondered. Once the idea had taken a hold of him, it was difficult to shake it off. So if we can master the changes in our body, does that mean warriors like us can become as powerful as bio-altered paranormals? Asked Quentin. That's right, said Charles. I don't think just anyone can do that, muttered Alice. But they can, said Charles, turning to her with a stern expression. Kevin is only at level 5. How do you think he's managed to kill more than 20 paranormals? Just talking about Kevin raised Charles's pulse. He hated to think of the spell Kevin seemed to have cast over Lena. Still, his feelings had calmed a little since he had first heard about it. He had originally thought Kevin was planning on stealing her away against her wishes, but he had since learned that she too had feelings for him. Although the news that Kevin had killed more than 20 paranormals hadn't spread very far, those assembled around Charles were all aware of it. They were desperate to hear how he had managed it. Quentin knew that Kevin was a touchy subject to bring up around Charles, but as it was important for them to understand the cultivation system, he pressed on with his questions. Could Kevin's abilities teach us something about where humanity is headed as far as cultivation is concerned? He asked. I don't know, said Charles. You don't know? Quentin asked, surprised by the straightforwardness of his answer. Of course I don't, said Charles, rolling his eyes. I'm only at the 7th level. How am I supposed to know about humanity's final path? But there's no use in trying to see too far into the future. If you're committed to walking this path, then focus on just the next few steps. All I know is that Kevin's approach is very risky, and that if you tried it without the correct knowledge or preparation, you could come to serious harm. The scouts were silent, chilled by Charles's warning. Kevin's talent is rare in this world, he continued. Although he reached level 3 even before the apocalypse began, he's since only advanced to level 5. That's because he's been too fixated on harnessing multiple powers at once. If he simply focused on one, he would have reached level 7 by now too. Instead, he's ended up at a sort of bottleneck. Going down that route might give you a broader range of powers, but your ability in each will be limited. In fact, it might even prevent you from developing your strength in the future, so don't force it. Just do your best with the abilities you already have. Charles's explanation satisfied everyone's curiosity. Even if they had had further questions, they realized that with so many new threats in the world, they would be lucky to live another year, let alone long enough that they had to worry about humanity's end goal. They realized that the most important thing for them was to improve their own strength and not spend too much time worrying about far-off matters. As soon as they had grasped that, they realized there was no use in pressing Charles for more details. It wouldn't bring them any benefit to worry about those around them surpassing their own power levels. They needed to focus solely on themselves. Charles had given his best understanding of the pros and cons of the different aspects of cultivation. Once his speech was over, and the soul energy of those around him had stabilized following their most recent breakthroughs, he took out the Water Mansion token. In the past, I wasn't strong enough to use this, he thought, but now I have some matters that need attending to. Determination shone in his eyes. Although he didn't know his opponents' plans, he knew that they had dared to play with the fate of humanity and get in his way, and for that, they needed to be taught a lesson. He used his soul energy to refine the Water Mansion token, extracting its energy into the purest form. Although the amount didn't seem too great, it was very powerful, and he was only able to extract it with a lot of effort. After he had done so, the token began to tremble in his hand. He sealed it to stop its energy from bursting out, and then he deposited it in the energy storage space. He was left with the small amount of soul energy that he extracted. He added it to his own soul energy, and was able to form it into a brand new extract amulet. He imprinted it into a tattoo on his arm, and then he sensed a strange feeling in his heart. We need to go north, he thought. The understanding had come to him in an instant. The extract amulet he had formed allowed him to detect the location of the enemy. It had shown him a vision of a huge lake covered in ice and snow. He wasn't the only person to receive such a vision. In the east, Archer had the same vision of the lake. What's going on? He wondered. Was it just me who sensed that? Something shifted, but it feels so far away. He frowned with confusion but quickly made up his mind. I need to go and find out what happened, but I don't think I'll be the only one who's on their way there. Elsewhere, many high-level paranormals felt the same call from the north. Charles could sense that those others had also been summoned to the lake. The same thing had happened when he had discovered the location of the Water Mansion. Alice looked troubled. I have this weird sense that there's something up north that can make me stronger, she said. Charles wasn't surprised that Alice had received the call too. After all, much of her strength came from the Gate of Hell, which also opened her up to detecting other powerful entities. Then let's go north, said Charles casually. Alice was surprised. She hadn't realized that Charles had also felt the same thing, and was shocked that he had made such a decision based solely on her gut feeling. It's just a gut feeling, she said. You don't have to change your schedule because of me. It's not just you, said Charles. I felt the same thing. She nodded and then she looked at Jenny. It'll be a long journey, she said. Should we send Jenny back first? Elena looked concerned, and Charles turned to her. You need to know that if we take Jenny with us, we'll be putting her in danger, he said. More and more people are learning about her existence, and they're bound to come after her. Elena was silent. She didn't want to put her daughter at any more risk, but she also understood that in the new state of the world, it was impossible to guarantee her absolute safety. I want to go, said Jenny. She wrestled free of Elena's embrace and jumped off the nightmare horse. So many people have sacrificed themselves to protect me. I don't want to be the reason for people dying anymore. I want to protect people instead. Her voice was soft but firm. The time she had spent with Charles and the others had taught her something of her unique abilities, even if she didn't understand them fully. But she knew that her uniqueness gave her a certain power and responsibility over her own actions. Elena was struck by her daughter's determination. But sweetie, she said before trailing off. Mom, said Jenny. So many people died for me, like back when I was saved from the scientists. I can't be responsible for that anymore. If I have to face the dangers of the world, I want to face them head on. Elena thought for a few moments before nodding. All right, she said. She had realized that she had been so concerned about Jenny's safety that she hadn't considered her actual needs. If Jenny needed to have some independence and responsibility, Elena thought that perhaps it was worth risking the dangers that might bring. She knew that her daughter was such a kind and sensitive child that if anyone else came to harm trying to protect her, it might have an emotional impact that she would feel all through her life. Jenny smiled at Elena's decision. By that point, the scouts had recovered from the effects of the Hellfire Lilies. Jenny's words had helped them to recognize their own need for responsibility and accountability. They were proud to have protected such a kind and generous soul, even if it had meant putting their lives on the line. If we're going to rely on our own strength to face whatever dangers will come, we need to work as hard as we can, said Charles, smiling in a way that put some of them on edge. We have a long journey ahead of us, but first we need to cross that river, And we'll be traveling on foot, of course. The scouts stared at him, open-mouthed. The scouts were shocked to hear about the journey they were about to make. They were particularly troubled that Charles had agreed to bring Jenny with them on the condition that she would fend for herself. It made them feel that he thought of them as no more powerful than a little girl. "Send the nightmare horses back to hell," he ordered, a mischievous smile on his lips. "Then put on your dark iron armor. It'll be heavy, but you'll be well protected for the journey. I'm sure you'll all be able to prove yourselves, but if you can't keep up with Jenny, we won't wait for you to catch up." He ignored the scouts' mutterings of complaint. Instead, he went around them, making sure that their armor and backpacks were properly fitted and the correct weight. "Everything looks good," he said, nodding in approval. The scouts were already sweating under their heavy loads, but they knew they would be humiliated if they were to admit defeat before the journey had even begun, and especially so if a young girl was able to complete it with ease. They had to simply pretend that they weren't carrying any extra weight. What they didn't know was that even without Jenny, Charles would have forced them to undertake the journey on foot. The properties of Hellfire Lilies were difficult for the body to digest. Although they could use meditation to stabilize their soul energy, the effects of the lilies would still pump their blood through their body faster and raise their internal temperature. The lilies also had a dangerous effect on their blood vessels, expanding them almost to a bursting point. As far as Charles was concerned, the simplest method of venting their energy was to run. If they could release the energy through exercise, the effects would present no danger at all. Alice created an ice bridge over the river. Once the scouts were across the bridge, they began to sprint at high speed. Although the more powerful among them wouldn't have suffered under their heavy armor at a walking pace, the speed at which Charles ordered them to run made it a challenge for even the strongest of them. Charles and Elena ran at the front, responsible for clearing the obstacles on the road. They would be able to kill any enemies they encountered on the trail, allowing the scouts to carry on sprinting without needing to stop. When Charles called for them to slow at the end of the first leg of their journey, everyone immediately stopped and cast their backpacks onto the ground, not wanting to bear such a heavy burden a moment longer. However, they had barely enjoyed the relief for a second before Charles gave another order. "You have to keep your backpacks on," he said. "Remember that when you're fighting in the wilderness, you won't have the opportunity to shed your load. On the contrary, your backpack will hold your most precious belongings, which you'll need to protect at all costs. And I didn't tell anyone they could stop. Carry on moving, although this time I'll let you go at half speed. In a while, I'll let you come to a slow stop." The scouts put their backpacks back on and carried on. They didn't complain, in part because they could already feel that their physical fitness had improved after the first run. Although their bodies were beginning to feel a little overworked, they also felt more relaxed. That was proof, if any was needed, that their development to the next level had been no illusion. They had never expected that they would be capable of running such a great distance, at such a speed, under such a burden. The fact that they had done so meant that Charles's medicine really had worked. After that stretch of running, Charles passed out some essence water to help the scouts recover their strength. It quickly rejuvenated them, and they could feel the relaxing effects of the Hellfire Lilies even more prominently. The running had had the effect that Charles had intended, using up the excess effects of the Hellfire Lilies and ensuring that the scouts wouldn't be harmed by generating too much soul energy. After recovering some of their strength, they were preparing to continue the long run when a crowd of mutated beasts appeared in front of them, blocking their way. Charles wasn't at all worried, seeing that even the strongest of the beasts was only at level 6. "Kill them," he ordered. The scouts ran forward, not even summoning their mounts. They made quick work of the first wave of beasts. Before long, they were surrounded by the corpses of hundreds of them. Charles watched their victory with detachment. He could hear that more beasts were on their way. "I can feel the energy flowing through my body much more easily than before," said Quentin. The others around him nodded, agreeing that they felt the same. They wondered if Charles's medicine could be replicated and released on a large scale. If they could manage that, it was difficult to see what would keep Dawn City from becoming the greatest power, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. They looked at him with hope in their eyes. It was clear in their minds just how useful the medicine could be. It wasn't that they had doubted its effects before, but after fighting the beast with such ease, they couldn't help but think of what Dawn City might achieve if the medicine was distributed far and wide. "You're getting all excited about the Hellfire Lilies and the medicine. But don't forget about the resources we already have available here on Earth, said Charles. The world is full of mutated plants and beasts, and you'd be able to gain just as much strength from medicines made from them as those made from plants or beasts from hell. It'd just take a little longer. He wasn't about to make his followers reliant on the Hellfire Lilies. They would need to make use of the resources on Earth, too. With the famines that the apocalypse had brought, people had been forced to try eating all sorts of plants that might well have brought them harm. And in doing so, they had discovered uses for many of them. Those with a close relationship to the land, who already knew traditional farming methods, were valued very highly in the survival bases. Even Olivia had hired some people from old farming families, paying a high price for their experience. Kevin, too, had a group of people with such knowledge under his command. Their contributions had gone a long way to reducing the casualties across Dawn City and the various survival bases. Naturally, the Hellfire Lilies had been very useful in developing the Scouts' strength, but Charles didn't have enough of them to rely on them as a long-term solution. At the end of the day, a person's strength could only get them so far. If the Dawnians were to achieve consistent and lasting victories, they needed to make the most of the ingredients found in the world around them. Although the world seemed full of despair, Charles was confident that human ingenuity and willingness to experiment with the resources around them would see them through. "Why are there so many mutated beasts?" asked a wind-powered paranormal as another wave approached. "It's like fighting the hordes of zombies all over again. Looks like our journey is going to be a bit slower than we expected." After the Dawnians had spent half an hour fighting the next wave of beasts, a swarm of bugs descended. It took them an hour to defeat them all, but in the end, they were surrounded only by corpses. Quentin had recovered from his excitement about the Hellfire Lilies. "Is it just me, or does it feel like these monsters deliberately sought us out?" he asked. The other scouts nodded. "Summon your steeds and let's get out of here," ordered Charles. Everyone summoned their nightmare horses and began to ride out, another group of beasts hot on their heels. They rode as fast as they could until they came to a swamp. Their hearts dropped when they saw their new obstacle. Even on top of their nightmare horses, it was difficult to see how they would be able to pass it. They also didn't like to think about what new dangers awaited within, and the swamp was so big that there didn't seem to be the option of skirting around it. All of a sudden, it felt that the entire world was against them. While they were trying to figure out their next move, a large flock of mutated cranes came flying toward them. Alice waved her hand, casting a deluge of water at them, and the cranes fell to the ground, unable to beat their sodden wings. They struggled to take flight while on the ground, but their efforts were useless. "Get off your horses," Charles ordered. "Remove your armor and get ready to fight." The scouts didn't understand his plan, but obeyed without objection. Mutated beasts started climbing out of the swamp, while the beasts and bugs that had been chasing them had finally caught up, accompanied by some zombies. After removing their heavy armor, the entire formation of level 6 scouts was easily able to crush such low-level monsters. Whenever any of them was in danger of using up too much soul energy, they retreated to recover with crystal cores or essence water while their teammates rushed in to take their place. The battle went on for 3 hours, with the beasts' bodies piling up around them. Such a length of high-intensity fighting overwhelmed even the hardiest of the scouts, and although they were able to replenish themselves with crystal cores, the new energy was quickly depleted. While they had been fighting, Charles had been busy building a simple fortress. "Everyone come back and rest," he called out when he had completed it. As the scouts pulled back, Charles opened the energy storage space, and a group of monsters piled out. At its lead was a group of 150 giant demons bearing dark iron battle axes and large square shields. It took less care and effort to process battle axes from dark iron instead of swords, so Charles had been able to arm the demons quickly. Also, the quality of the materials for the axes was greater than for the swords. The giant demons formed a circle with their backs to each other, surrounding the camp that Charles had made. Their shields formed a protective wall that stopped most of the beasts getting through, while they were quickly able to dispatch those that tried with their axes. After that formation had been established, 300 blade demons left the energy storage space, accompanied by 150 shadow demons. Any beasts that were able to get through the wall of giant demons would have to face the blade and shadow demons, which were so agile that even the flying insects were unable to dodge them. Even more creatures came out of the storage space. Next were 100 magma monsters, which had flesh like cracked red clay and held red spears.
They had posed a serious challenge to Charles during his last visit to Hell, but they had since joined his side. Those spearmen were the best soldiers in the entire army. After the magma monsters came a group of dark mages, which released dark spells at the flying beasts. Although they didn't deal any fatal damage, their attacks were enough to bring the creatures to the ground, where the demons were able to rush in and finish them off. The mutated beasts kept up their assault, but were all swiftly killed when they met Charles's formidable defending forces. The scouts were dumbstruck to see so many hellish creatures fighting in such a coordinated manner. Many of them had encountered such demons face to face in battle while in Hell, so they knew how formidable they could be. And yet they were still surprised by just how powerful they were when working together. The combined forces of the demons and mages comprised the Dark Legion that Charles had created in Hell. He hadn't yet had cause to call upon them, but their time had finally come. Quentin smiled bitterly. "Something tells me this battle is about to get a whole lot easier," he said. Alice nodded. "Even if they're only good as cannon fodder, there's so many of them that they'll surely help us win the battle," she said. She had changed a lot since the beginning of the apocalypse, and had become hardened to the callous strategies required in war. Therefore, she didn't see anything wrong with using the Dark Legion as cannon fodder if it meant protecting her fellow humans. "This is impossible," said Elena. "Why?" asked Alice. "Well, think about it," said Elena. "Why would these creatures follow Charles's orders?" "Because he's more powerful than any of them," said Alice. Elena instantly understood. The reason that Charles was able to use the Dark Legion as cannon fodder was that he had made them submit with his superior strength. He had so completely dominated them that they had no choice but to go into battle and fight for him. That was their only chance to increase their own strength. "We need to rest while we can," said Charles. "Everyone who's prepared their own defenses should try to sleep or meditate. In either case, you need to rest for 6 hours before rejoining the battle." Elena was a little confused. "Aren't we heading north?" she asked. "Why do we have to fight these monsters to the death? If we speed up, won't we lose them?" The scouts who had been on their way to rest stopped in their tracks. "If we kill a lot of monsters here, that means there will be fewer monsters attacking other people elsewhere," said Jenny. Everyone turned to her, stunned by her wisdom. They hadn't considered that point, but realized at once that she had just summarized the reason Charles had transferred half of the Knights of Hell to the Midwest. It also explained why he hadn't returned to Dawn City as soon as the trade route had been opened. He was committed to killing all the beasts he could to protect everyone across the country. Charles didn't look at Jenny. "The beasts have many useful materials and resources," he said vaguely. "For example, we can sell their hides for a good price." Jenny looked at him quizzically, not believing that that was his real motive. Before she could say anything, Alice covered her mouth. "Charles is stubborn," she said quietly. "You might be right about his motives, but if you expose them in front of everyone, he won't thank you for it." Meanwhile, the scouts couldn't help snickering at Jenny's words and their obvious effect on Charles. "What are you laughing about?" Charles said. "Hurry up and get some rest." After the fight, Charles felt himself growing closer to the scout regiment. He had always projected a cold, uncaring attitude to the world, but his personality was warming up, although he couldn't explain why. Alice came up to Charles. "Did Jenny get you?" she asked with a smile. He didn't admit it, but he didn't deny it either. He could have used his considerable speed to cross the area and set up camp farther away from the monsters, which would have saved a lot of time, but he had still chosen to fight them there. He felt he was just doing what he could to help others, and it didn't seem like a big deal to him. All living creatures required a certain amount of time to grow. This limitation even applied to the people who controlled the 3 legendary tablet treasures. Charles knew that if they could kill a large number of mutated beasts there, the center of the country would be safer. Although Charles had made sufficient preparations for the Midwest, he had also made up his mind not to be a hero. He knew he couldn't position himself as some kind of savior, but he still wanted the freedom to follow his instincts. He felt that if he couldn't do what he wanted to do, then there was no point in working so hard to increase his strength. The night had grown long, and the darkness lasted 17 hours on average. For the first 6 hours of the battle, Charles was in the middle of the fray, so there weren't too many casualties. After another 6 hours of fighting, he summoned a group of hellhounds to guard the others while he and Alice rested for a moment.
They fought all night, and it was daybreak before the battle finally ended. The monsters hadn't caused them too much damage, but their march had been greatly hindered during the night. After they all rested, Charles was about to give the order to set off again when Jenny wandered off toward the swamp. "Jenny, stop!" Elena called, running after her. "Come back here, it's too dangerous." Jenny stretched out her small hand and pointed in the distance. "But I feel something there," she said. "Don't let me go instead," Charles said, looking in the direction she was pointing. He took tentative steps forward because the ground was slippery and unstable. When he arrived at the edge of the swamp, he saw a white crane with a red head. It had a broken leg and a broken wing. It was protecting a cluster of eggs under its body. The crane gave Charles a pleading look. It seemed to understand that it and its children wouldn't survive. With a fluttering sound, a few smaller cranes flapped their wings and came to their parents' side, surrounding it protectively. It anxiously called out to the young cranes, as if warning them to leave. Charles watched their interaction silently, and he was moved. His heart wasn't completely made of stone after all. There had been some mutated cranes among the hellish creatures that had attacked him the previous night, and he never held back against anything that made itself his enemy. But he could tell that the crane with a broken leg and a broken wing clearly hadn't been part of the attack. The swamp was dangerous, and the crane had lost the power to protect itself. Charles frowned. "Give up," he said. "You can't keep your children safe anymore." With Alice's protection, Jenny stepped off the frozen road and approached the swamp. She extended her hand to the crane. "I'll protect its babies," she declared. "They may be in even more danger by your side," Charles said harshly. Jenny shook her head firmly. "Maybe so, but they'll die if they stay here." As she spoke, her eyes fell on a snake not far away. It was intelligent enough to know that Charles wasn't an enemy to be trifled with, so it stayed where it was. "In my view, this crane is no different from that snake," Charles continued. "We can train them," Jenny said quickly, "just like you trained the Dark Legion. Then they can serve us. And if they won't obey, we'll just abandon them." She set her jaw. Jenny had been educated under Charles and Elena long enough to know that they would never let her adopt a pet that didn't provide some kind of value to them. If she just wanted to be kind, then leaving the cranes to their own devices was the best way to do that. But she felt that if Charles could command the Dark Legion, then she should be able to adopt some cranes. The injured crane gingerly approached Jenny and cooed something to the juvenile cranes, who then surrounded Jenny and hopped on her shoulders one by one. With his soul energy, Charles perceived that Jenny seemed to have established some sort of inexplicable connection with the baby cranes. Jenny has a special ability, he thought. He knew she had a gentle energy, so it wasn't surprising that she had attracted the affection of some mutated beasts. If she could tame them and improve the relationship between humans and mutated beasts, then he didn't see the harm in letting her try. "All right," he said once he had made up his mind. "But you're responsible for them, and if the cranes just eat our food and don't prove useful, then I'll have to treat them as food reserves." He would never raise a pet that only consumed food and gave nothing in return. "No!" Jenny exclaimed. She patted her chest and promised that wouldn't happen. Charles put the eggs into his energy storage space. Then he got out some food and fed the baby cranes. He used some straw to weave nests that he put in boxes, and then he summoned 3 fire horses to carry the boxes. Jenny clapped her hands in delight. It seemed that the little cranes would survive after all. And once the eggs hatched, she would have even more friends. Charles used the extract amulet to increase the strength of the cranes, and they were soon able to fly. They flew in circles around Jenny, and some even landed on Jenny's or Elena's shoulders. Charles had no idea how much his decision would affect him in the future. The group slowly traveled north. During the day, monsters occasionally blocked their path. At night, bugs and mutated beasts charged their camp recklessly. But such a dangerous environment greatly increased the Daunians' alertness, and after 5 days of fighting, everyone's strength had increased yet again. Charles contacted Dawn City and the Midwest Caravan, and received word that everything was well with them. Although the mutated beasts and zombies had grown quite a bit stronger, they still weren't much of a threat. That wasn't surprising to him.
Dawn City was the strongest force in the eastern US. If they were ever in trouble, then the entire region would be plunged into misery and suffering. And since the military had gotten its supplies, the Midwest was beginning to show its might. 100,000 soldiers with dark iron swords fiercely killed scores of mutated beasts. If a soldier died, another quickly took up their sword and continued fighting. The dark iron swords were very good quality, and they allowed the soldiers to fight at a level above their own strength. Because of the sacrifice of thousands of soldiers, vast numbers of beasts were driven away. That might have sounded like heavy casualties to some, but Charles knew from his experiences in his previous life that such a sacrifice was really very small. Of course, it helped that his group had attracted a large amount of the monsters' attention, which gave the military and civilian forces in the Midwest a chance to catch their breath. Meanwhile, Dawn City was set to make a fortune from all the resources they had scavenged from the beasts they had killed. A lot of people complained about Dawn City capitalizing on the spoils of war, but the military understood what the Dawnians had sacrificed to help them. And since they were fighting side by side with them, the friendship between the Dawnians and the Midwest military grew by the day. Many powerful Dawnian paranormals and warriors inevitably developed friendships with the people in the Midwest when they fought together. The main disadvantage of this arrangement was that the Dawnians had decided to sell many private weapons to their friends in the military at a low price, which had reduced Dawn City's profits. But Charles didn't care about that. As long as the price they had agreed on in the beginning was still good, there was no need for him to object or interfere. Their primary goal was to build a good relationship with the military. He couldn't afford not to. After 5 days of traveling northwest, they had passed through the plains and mountains of the northern U.S. and finally arrived at the grasslands just before the Canadian border, which had turned into a snowy plain. Charles instructed everyone to change their mounts to level 5 two-horned horses. Then he asked everyone to take off their heavy armor and change into wolfskin coats. We can rely on our vigor and our soul energy to resist the cold, but it'll consume a great deal of energy, he explained along the way. That could really affect our strength for a prolonged battle. Even if we use a bunch of crystal cores, they can't compensate for the energy consumption. I treated these wolf skins with high temperatures to kill any germs or toxic substances. They'll keep us warm far better than ordinary fur, and that'll save us a lot of energy. No one objected. They had all spent the past few days in high-intensity battles, so they knew the importance of maintaining physical strength in lengthy combat. Recent experiences had also increased everyone's wilderness survival skills, and even the military scouts could no longer compare to the Dawnian ones. The young cranes on Jenny's shoulders trembled in the cold. She asked Charles if the cranes could take shelter in his energy storage space, but he refused. Jenny was dejected. If the environment was too intense for the little cranes to survive, she didn't see much point in having rescued them in the first place. But at least the cranes didn't pose too much of a logistical burden. They ate the bugs that everyone killed, and there were always plenty of bugs in the world, so Charles bore the cranes no ill will. Since they had already reached level 3, given a bit more time, they would grow big enough to hunt bugs on their own, and Charles knew they would become completely independent soon after that. The sky darkened, and they set up camp. Everyone chose a place to rest out of the wind as they prepared to fight more monsters. A few scouts went out to gather information and deal with any immediate threats. You can untie your wolfskin coats and use them as blankets, Charles informed everyone. But don't get too comfortable. If the camp is attacked, we need to be able to quickly pick up our weapons and fight. Everyone was used to Charles's harsh tone, but some of them still questioned his instructions. They wondered why they should worry about their safety when there were so many Dark Legion demons outside to protect them. But those who voiced that opinion were berated by Charles. What he wanted was a force that could survive independently, even if he left them, not an army that relied solely on him. Once the people understood that, they realized the painstaking efforts he had made so that the Dark Legion would fight by their side. Once they had set up camp, they started a fire. Charles had asked each of them to bring a large amount of coal with them, and the tree ants in his energy storage space provided a special type of wood that gave more heat than coal did. He didn't summon many Dark Legion demons because there were fewer enemies in that area. He knew if he summoned too many, the scout regiment wouldn't remain as vigilant. Joshua soon returned with a group of scouts. Mayor Federer, there's a group of livestock herders on the grassland ahead of us, he reported. They're armed, and their mounts are some kind of mutated horses. They spotted us and didn't even try to communicate before they attacked us, but we didn't fight them.
This is their territory after all. He didn't have any feelings, good or bad, for the herders, and they thought it made sense that the herders were angry. After all, the Daunians had invaded their land. Charles knew they had to be careful. If they accidentally started a war, it wouldn't be good for either side. "Put out the fire," he ordered. "I'll go and check it out. You stay here." Under the cover of night, he summoned Bullet and rushed in the direction Joshua and the others had come from. Bullet was very fast, and it didn't take long for Charles to find the group of herders. There were about 300 or 400 of them, and they rode horses of a much lower level than Bullet. Using his soul energy, Charles eavesdropped on the herders' conversation. They spoke English, although it wouldn't have been a big deal for him if they hadn't. Some creatures with powerful bloodlines who had reached level 6 could express their meaning through soul energy rather than words, allowing anyone to understand them. Humans hadn't yet obtained that ability, but once they reached level 7, they could determine someone's meaning through mental energy fluctuations. Charles was particularly tenacious because of his rebirth. In the Nameless Ancient book, he had discovered a special technique for using soul energy, so he could understand any language, even those he wasn't familiar with. He listened as the herders sat on the backs of their mutated horses and chatted without regard for who might have been listening. "Damn that Wolf King! His pack ate almost all our cattle and sheep. He must be crazy! I understand wanting to control some of the wolves, but his pack has grown too large too quickly. It could wipe out the entire country soon at this rate. The cattle and sheep we raised should have been our best yield yet after those mutations, but that bastard Wolf King had to eat them all. Now I'll have to head south to hunt. But these grasslands have always been our pastures, and we'll come back to reclaim them." "That's right. I swear this is our chance to make something of ourselves." The herders had learned in school about how their ancestors had raised livestock in the grasslands, and they dreamed of returning the area to its former glory. Even though the wolves had destroyed their herds, it was a new world, and they thought anything was possible. Charles frowned as he secretly listened to their conversation. He rolled his eyes at their desire to reclaim the land and make something of themselves, thinking they must not have realized that times had changed. He was surprised by the mention of the Wolf King. He thought he had killed that wolf, and he'd even had a coat made out of its fur. Did Gideon find another Wolf King? He wondered. Or someone else controlling this one? Charles believed in fate because he felt that was the only way he could control it. He didn't think the arrival of the Wolf King was a coincidence. It was a necessary part of the way events would unfold. But he didn't have the time or energy to think about that right then, and he issued an order through his communication token for the others to join him. "Their plan is to travel south and start hunting there," he briefly explained. "I don't think they'll cause too much damage, but we can't let them get away with it. We have to show them our strength as a deterrent." None of the Daunians had any problems with Charles's plan, and they quickly prepared for battle. But before they could make a move toward the herders, countless pairs of glowing eyes appeared in the dark. "Stop," Charles called to the others, calling off their sneak attack. The wolf pack had appeared, and the herders shouted in panic. "It's the wolves again! The Wolf King is coming! Run! Scatter!" Several hundred wolves charged toward the group of herders, knocking down the slower people and ripping out their throats. The horses ran from the wolves helter-skelter, like rats being pursued by cats. The few sheep that had been left after the previous attack did the same. After a bit of fighting, about 100 herders escaped and ran a short distance away. But before they could catch their breath, another 200 glowing eyes came out from behind a small hill in front of them. "No!" a herder cried. "Please spare us, Wolf King," another begged. "We'll follow you, we swear." But the wolves ignored their wailing and killed all the herders and their mounts. Then they feasted on their corpses. While they were enjoying their meal, a giant wolf with silver fur emerged from the pack. All the other wolves lowered their heads in its wake. A burly young man walked beside the giant silver wolf, stepping on the herders' bodies in disdain. "You pieces of garbage want to work for me?" he scoffed. "You weaklings don't even compare to my wolves. You're more useful as their food." To him, it didn't matter if they were humans or wolves. It only mattered if he could put them to good use. Besides, he already had the wolves to serve him, so there was no need for him to put up with useless people. The Daunians had watched in shock as the wolves had devoured the herders. They thought the man was ruthless to have dealt with fellow humans so mercilessly. Charles was also secretly shocked. As he observed the group of wolves, he discovered that their strength had reached the peak of level 6, and that they exuded a dangerous aura. They were even stronger than the previous Black Wolf King. Charles saw that the young man beside the new Silver Wolf King was Gideon. People often said that Gideon had a great reputation because of the power of the Wolf King he had befriended, but Charles knew it was really the other way around. It was only because of Gideon's nurturing that the wolf had become one of the 10 beasts of the apocalypse. The wolf was much stronger than Gideon, but that didn't matter. After all, lion tamers didn't have to be stronger than the lions they trained. A coach could still train athletes with superior physical fitness. Charles himself had trained the Black Lightning Dragon, so it didn't seem strange to him. But many people didn't think like Charles. They were too easily impressed or made inaccurate judgments out of jealousy. A few figures in black rode mutated horses to Gideon's side and whispered something in his ear. Then Gideon turned, and his gaze fell on Charles. Gideon cursed under his breath. He saw us. He didn't meet Gideon's eye, but he knew he had been discovered. Just as he was about to give the order to attack, Gideon blew a whistle. All the wolves bit off one last piece of meat from their prey and fled into the distance. Charles was stunned. He hadn't thought he had left such a shadow of fear on Gideon. Considering the size of the wolf pack, he thought it should have been the other way around. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Charles knew Gideon wasn't a coward. He just wouldn't want to fight a battle he was sure to lose. If there was even a small chance of winning, he would fight to the death. Charles saw more than 700 wolves present and detected even more at the edge of his soul energy's range. In only 5 days, the wolf pack had grown exponentially, and there was a new Wolf King no less powerful than the first. Even without outside help, Gideon's force was formidable. In Charles's previous life, Gideon had eventually made a deal with the people of the Demon Realm when he had run out of other options. Charles wondered if that time had come much earlier in his new life. With more than 700 wolves, Gideon could have taken on the Daunians. The only reasonable explanation for why he would retreat instead was that he had heard about Charles's Dark Legion. Reluctantly, Charles ordered his troops to withdraw, realizing it wasn't the best time to try to take Gideon down anyway. The next time they clashed, Charles knew he had to destroy the enemy in one strike, so that he wouldn't have the chance to regrow his forces. Besides, Gideon had seen Charles and had immediately led the pack of wolves away. Even if Charles went after them, the most he could do was kill a few wolves. He would rather wait until he could get them all at once. After the Daunians returned to camp, everyone rested. The chances of them being ambushed at night were low, but they still had to be on alert just in case. They rested in turn so that there was always someone on watch. Even the Dark Legion had to rest. Charles had a feeling they were being tracked by someone, and it made him uneasy. But he knew that was inevitable at that stage in the journey, and there was no way to avoid it. The farther north they went, the shorter the days became. There were only 6 hours of daylight, and even that was nearly as dim as night. When they were halfway through their journey, they encountered another group of about 200 herders. Charles's group only had about 30 people, so the herders charged after them with a shout. "They have fewer people! Kill them!" When the Daunians saw Charles draw the sword from his waist, they did the same. It was obvious what had to be done, and they didn't hesitate to kill the herders, who then tried to flee. Only 15 minutes later, one of the Daunian scouts struck down the last of the herders. It had been an absolute slaughter. The strongest herder among them had only been a level 5, which was nothing compared to the elite Daunian fighters. And with the great speed of the nightmare horses, the herders couldn't even have hoped to escape. "Did you kill all these people?" a cold voice asked. The Daunians turned in the direction of the voice and saw a woman walking toward them over the snow. Her blue clothes sparkled with some mysterious element, and a dozen people trailed behind her. As she approached, they could see her features more clearly. Her eyes were as clear as water, and she had a severe expression that made them afraid to get too close to her. Alice looked at Charles nervously. She was afraid this beautiful woman might be another competitor for his affections. "So what if we killed them?" Charles said nonchalantly. He didn't mind admitting it. The woman's followers cursed at him. "That's awful! You're all butchers!" "Yeah,
You're cold-blooded and heartless." Charles was surprised by their attitudes. It had been a long time since the apocalypse had begun. He wondered how those people had survived for so long if they were so against killing. He offered a lazy explanation. "These people wanted to kill us, so we killed them first. They deserved it. If there's nothing else you want, then we'll be on our way." He prepared to leave with his people, not giving so much as a second glance toward the woman. He would never let beauty distract him from his business. "Wait a minute," the woman said flatly. "You can't leave until I've investigated the matter thoroughly." As soon as she finished speaking, trees made of ice sprouted from the ground all around the Daunians, trapping them in a garden of ice. Not even the nightmare horses could escape. The Daunians marveled at her ability. They had encountered many water-type paranormals, but none of them had ever had such power over ice and snow. The ice garden she had formed surrounded them, blocking their path entirely. Though the trees were made of ice, they were all vivid and lifelike. The leaves were so clear that they could see the veins underneath. Charles sucked in a shocked breath. "It's her," he thought in recognition. In his previous life, there had been only one person who could do such a thing, and that had been Catherine Young, who had been called the Ice Queen. She was a descendant of an ancient martial family and was a proficient fighter. She had also awakened her water-type superpower, and her control over ice and snow was unparalleled. She had become a saint-level master and one of the pillars of humanity in his previous life, but she had had no permanent home and had moved about from place to place, indifferent to the scheming of various forces. He knew she also had a strong sense of justice, but she wasn't pedantic, and she wouldn't sacrifice herself for others. "This has nothing to do with justice," she'd always claimed. "I do as I please."